What's up, everybody? Matt Gajewski here, back again with the Stochastic channel. Today we're talking some college football DFS out of the Friday 3-game slate. It's week 4. 3 games is a nice treat for us. Before we get started, hit the thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you know when this and all other content goes live. We're also brought to you by Bet365, and they have a deal for those of you in Kentucky, Ohio, New Jersey, Virginia, Iowa, Colorado, Louisiana, Indiana, Arizona, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania. What you'll do is click the link below, make your first deposit, then make a wager on any game. It can be a total, a spread, whatever you want. Whether it wins or loses, you will get $200 in the form of bonus credits. You must be 21 or older to play, 18 in Kentucky. If you or someone you know has a gambling problem, please call or text 1-800-GAMBLER. All right, behind the glass, we go 3-game slate. This is our data usage tool where you can see all kinds of data. We have our game environment statistics up at the top, seconds per play, pass rate, Vegas data, what these defenses are allowing. Then we have all the matchup data from the most recent games from all the teams in the slate. So we'll kick this off with Stanford taking on Syracuse. It's a 9.5-point spread in favor of Syracuse, 57.5 total. Both these teams are off a bye. Last time we saw Stanford, they were beaten up on Cal Poly. Prior to that, they lost a 7-point game to TCU. Syracuse most recently beat Georgia Tech, and prior to that, we saw them play a somewhat close game against Ohio, which was a bit of a surprise. Anyway, fast game here. Stanford 15th in pace, Syracuse 61st. Pass rate good for both teams. Stanford currently at 52%. Syracuse running a bit of an air raid. They're nearly at 60% passing. On the Stanford side, Ashton Daniels is somewhat interesting for DFS because he does have a very high percentage of this team's carries. Leads the team in total attempts and not just from scrambles and sacks. Designed attempts, Ashton Daniels is the leader for this team. Now, he mitigates some of that with sacks. He's currently averaging just over 60 yards per game on the ground, which is still pretty good. Definitely interested in Ashton Daniels for that floor. And then 29 attempts per game, 192 yards through the air. I'm not really sure how good he has to be because we have such elite players on the other side. So that is somewhat interesting to me. In the backfield, expecting a committee between Micah Ford, Cedric Irvin, and maybe Chris Davis. I don't know if he's going to play a lot. Basically, all 6 of his carries came against the FCS team. At the very least, it should be Micah Ford and Cedric Irvin, but we already know the quarterback is going to play a large component of this run game. And then they gave Ismail Cisse 4 carries total, 2 in each game as well. So he'll be a factor too. They're just punts if you need to go all the way down. And I'm not entirely interested in these players. It's basically forward or pass. In the receiving game, Elike Manor, he's an absolute stud. 6,500 is too cheap of a price tag, as well as 8,500 on FanDuel. Surprised by both of those. He currently has a 25% target share. They just didn't really use him against the FCS team is what it is. 12 targets in their first game. I have no problem getting to him. Ismail Cisse has been a surprise. He was not projected to be a starter for this team, but he very much has been, and I think we need to start taking notice. They're giving him carries in these games. His route rate was at 55% in week 1. It jumped to 78% against the FCS team, which they, for what it's worth, they did play their starters a lot. You know, Elike Manor wasn't a large part of the game plan, but he still had a 91% route participation in that week 2 game against Cal Poly. So he ran with the starters. That's notable to me. The third pass catcher we should look at, I think, is Sam Roush. 7 total targets for him. He plays a tight end position. He comes in very cheap, which is more notable than, you know, like a Tiger Bachmeier at 5,100. Now, Bachmeier is a pretty good buy low. His route participation is still very good. He's at 66% on the year, was above 70% in week 1, their competitive game. Just only 3 targets. So that is somewhat concerning, but I think we can go right back. Otherwise, the other players to mention, Jackson Harris, he saw his routes cut in week 2 after the 8-target week 1 game. So that's somewhat concerning to me. That was with Moody Rubin playing more in week 2. I don't know what to make of these guys. So I'll rank them as Elike Manor 1, Cisse 2, Roush 3, Tiger Bachmeier 4. Followed by your dart throws, Harris and Moody Rubin. But not a ton of interest in those guys. I'll play this one pretty close to the projections overall. On the other side, Syracuse on the other side. Offense isn't terribly different, just a little slower, passing a little more. And Kyle McCord has been awesome, but weaker opponents overall. Georgia Tech's actually not that weak, so, it's actually been pretty impressive. 367.5 yards per game. He never runs, so sacks are always going to be a concern. But 43 attempts, his volume should get him there quite a bit. Excuse me. But he's 8,400, so there is some concern. There are, I think, a couple quarterbacks I would rather get to, but he's right in the conversation. I think there's one clear quarterback for cash, and that's Mateer. But after that, I think you could make some arguments for other players. McCord's certainly live in tournaments. He very easily could bonus on this volume. In the backfield, LaQuint Allen, 15 carries in back-to-back games. He's sharing more of the workload than you might think. Will Nixon has 12 carries. He had 9 in their last game. That was against Georgia Tech, and it came down to the wire. So I don't think it's going to be like the 25-touch LaQuint Allen show we've seen for a while. With that said, he still had 22 touches, and he had 8 targets. So it doesn't really matter if he cedes some carries to Will Nixon. This pass game role is still ridiculous, and his route share is up above 60%. So, LaQuint Allen's still firmly in play, especially on DK where he's 7K, no issues getting there. Will Nixon, somewhat interesting, just not going to catch any balls. He's a change of pace back. In the receiver room, Oronde Gadsden, he's averaging over 100 yards per game, 9 targets per game. There's not really much you can say about him. He's just an absolute stud. If you prefer him over A.O. Manor, I wouldn't fault you. I think he's an excellent play. It's beyond him where things get a little bit weird. Zeed Haynes, Trevor Pena, and Umari Hatcher have been the 3 wide receivers in the field. So Zeed Haynes, he had 62% of the routes up to 75 against Georgia Tech. Trevor Pena was at 74 up to 83, and Umari Hatcher went from 76 down to 65. So right away, I would say Pena is your number 2 in this offense. He's been the second most efficient, and he has the second most consistent routes. Zeed Haynes, I think, is 3, 9 targets in the last game. I think he's completely fine. I'm a little worried about Umari Hatcher. First of all, Jackson Meeks has been playing occasionally for this team. His route share has been at 33% and then went up to 48%. But the other concern is they're projected to return Justice Ross Simmons, the Colorado State transfer in this game, who's been out since camp with a hamstring injury. How many routes does he run? I'm just not sure. But I would find it hard to believe, first of all, they're not taking Gadsden or Pena off the field, I would guess. And I don't think they would take Zeed Haynes. Meeks and Hatcher are more of questions to me with the return of Justice Ross Simmons. I don't want to play any of them, but I will play Zeed Haynes at 46. And then Pena and Gadsden firmly in play. Gadsden on FanDuel at AK is unbelievably low. Play him over there. Second game, Illinois takes on Nebraska. 8.5-point spread in favor of Nebraska, 43 total, which is the lowest on the slate by a wide margin. Illinois has not really seen the best of their competition so far. Eastern Illinois, Central Michigan were blowouts, and then they had a sub 50% post-game win expectancy against Kansas. They ended up winning. So I don't know. They were very tough to evaluate. I've never really been a Luke Altmaier guy. This offense is super slow, 122nd with a 48% pass rate. He's averaging 26 attempts per game. He doesn't run a ton. He has functional mobility, so he's not really alive to give you 300 yards through the air or anything significant on the ground. I'd rather find the salary to get to Daniels or certainly McCord. He'll be pretty low on the ranking list for me. Not to mention the game total is just pretty bad, and their team total is barely above 17 points. The backfield has devolved into a committee, which is very, very tough to see. Aiden Lawfery was out of their last game, which makes this even more alarming because Caden Fagan's role was cut, and they won by 21 points. So take this with a little bit of a grain of salt, but also, Khalil Valentine's been awesome. Josh McCray's been good. Fagan's been decent. They just have a lot of options to use. I don't think you ever really see the full workhorse role for Caden Fagan. He's averaging 15 touches per game. That's come down recently. 57.5 rushing yards per game. He also isn't a stone cold lock to catch passes either. He has 4 targets this year, 31% route share, which is coming down. So I'm a little worried there. I think we're just potentially seeing full-blown committee out of Illinois. He'll lead it, but I don't feel good that he has a large workload share. The one redeeming quality he does have is he's massive, so when they get down by the goal line, he is likely to score touchdowns. So you can still throw some darts on him because of that. Pass game is pretty easy for Illinois. You've got two absolute alphas in Zachary Franklin and Pat Bryant. Routes are a little better for Pat Bryant. Efficiency is a little better for Zachary Franklin, and his target share is higher. It's 30% to 22 for Bryant. I'm not really worried about either one. I think they just kind of ebb and flow, so I'm willing to play them both. In stacks if that's how you go with Altmaier. Routes are both there for these guys. Their wide receiver 3 is split in a pretty gnarly fashion between a lot of guys. You have Colin Dixon at like 35% of the routes. Love the unders on his props this week. You have Ashton Hollins in the mix. You have Hank Beatty in the mix at around 30% of routes. Malik Elzy's been playing a decent amount. Even Kenari Wilcher occasionally. There's just no clear wide receiver 3, so not playing Beatty, betting unders on his props, I think is completely fine. The tight end has been a revolving door for this team. Like, they're playing so poorly that some of them are getting benched because they're just getting so many penalties. It's actually pretty wild how many times the Illinois tight ends have been penalized. If you do play one, it's Tanner Arkin in the 2 meaningful games they played this year before the Central Michigan game. He was at 70% of the routes, went 70, 73, 39. So I'm still certainly concerned. Not a lock by any means. It's basically Zachary and Pat Bryant, and I would rather play Zachary at price on both sides. Nebraska, I don't know if this is just like the Patrick Mahomes tax on Dylan Raiola or what's going on. This team is 115th in pace with a 45% pass rate. Yeah, their competition hasn't been good. They played UTEP, who's basically an FCS team, Northern Iowa, who is an FCS team, and Colorado, who couldn't get out of their own way. That's 3 double-digit wins. What would this offense look like if they had played a competent opponent? Not sure. I tend to think they would pass more and play faster. Does that overcome some of the efficiency decreases we're expecting the offense to see in their first tough game? I'm not sure. Raiola's props are around like 220 yards, which flat out makes him way too expensive because he's giving you 0 on the ground. He has 14 rushing yards this year, and I'm honestly surprised they're that high. He's perhaps the easiest fade on the slate. The only thing I'll be considering is just ownership once it gets to a certain point. Perhaps you play him just because there's a good team that's favored, and I'm no buyer of Illinois. In the backfield, if this remains close enough, I have a lot of interest in Dante Dowdell. 17 carries in their only competitive game this year. He's not going to be the pass catching back. That's largely Ramir Johnson, who has a 42% route share and had 9 targets in that Colorado game. So you definitely need to get there on the ground. But what looks like a 4-back committee on paper, I have a theory that it might be closer to a 2-back committee when they need to actually play tough in these competitive games. We didn't really see a lot of Emmett Johnson or Gabe Irving in that competitive Colorado game. We saw a ton of Dowdle on the ground, and we saw a lot of Romero Johnson in the pass game. So that's where I would focus my attention for Nebraska's run game. In the receiving room, top 2 are Nair and Jamal Banks. I prefer Nair straight up over Banks right now. His role is just a little more consistent. Route rate against Colorado, he was at 84%. Banks was at 81%. So it's just been a little better, as well as the target share for him. Their wide receiver 3 has been a disaster. The player who's been on the field the most is Janaran Bonner, but he has 5 targets. He is one of the worst targets per route rate in all of college football. So I would be very concerned that he starts losing snaps at some point. But to whomst, I'm not sure. Ja'Cory Barney is like a gadget player. No more than 31% of their routes in any game. Carter Nelson, even lower, like Jalen Lloyd's at around 15%. They just haven't shown a willingness to play anyone else. So I guess if you need to throw a dart at Tim, but honestly, I'd rather play Thomas Fidone at 3,700, who's just a little bit cheaper, but he's on the field more, and he actually has more targets by 1, but it is more. And that about does it for Nebraska. Interesting team. Also, if you want this information, this data, our projections, our industry leading, so I'm trying to say projections, they're available in the links below. Our Sims tool has been absolutely dominating this year. I see all you guys at the top of the leaderboards. Been awesome to see. Last game is San Jose State, Washington State. This is a fun one out west. 55.5 total is pretty good on this slate. 11.5 point spread in favor of Washington State. People have been pounding San Jose in the market, which I strongly disagree with. Still, they're 41st in pace with a 56% pass rate, so that's interesting for DFS. My concerns are they've just played maybe the easiest schedule in all of college football. They beat Sacramento State, who's an FCS team. Air Force. Okay, so in the overall power ratings that I have, Air Force currently ranks 113th. That was a 10-point win. And then Kennesaw ranks 126th. Kennesaw is making the jump from FCS. Those are the three teams they've played. They lost their coaching staff and had a ton of turnover this year, so I've got major concerns. As far as DFS goes, Emmett Brown, I think, is appropriately priced for as much as this team is passing and as fast as they are. He's taken way too many sacks. Negative 33 yards through 3 games. That's negative 11 yards per game. That's minus a point. It's likely to be worse against Washington State because, again, they've played nothing but cupcakes. That also probably hurts his efficiency. He's averaging 305 yards per game. Now they're playing a significantly more difficult opponent. I would be floored if the efficiency remains constant with him. I'm probably going to fade and play some other cheaper players. I'm not really that interested. The backfield is very difficult to parse. So they played Kennesaw, and Floyd Chalk, who had 18 and 15 carries, dropped to 3. I parsed the internet, could not find an injury. So there's a chance this is also a changing of the guard to Jabari Bates, who's seen his carries rise in 3 straight games. This team does not throw to the running back. They actually have one of the highest pass blocking rates in the entire country. It's actually mind-blowing to see how much this team is using their running back to pass block. I couldn't believe it when I saw it. I'll try to pull it up for you guys. It was mind-blowing, but the route rates are just horrific for all these running backs. Even when they're in pass situations, I'm not expecting them to participate. So right now we have a 7% route participation for Bates and 19% for Chalk. You're not going to see any passes caught by these guys. That makes me concerned. The only thing that really keeps them in play is their price. It seems DraftKings and FanDuel both don't know who's going to see the work. And they've used like a semi-lead back in every game. It just hasn't been the same one. So you can throw some darts. I'm not really that interested. I'd rather throw some darts and pay up a little bit more for like the Nebraska backs, or maybe play like Micah Ford for Stanford. What I will do is play some of these receivers. It doesn't matter if the efficiency is worse for San Jose State because Nick Nash is averaging 15 targets per game and 162 yards. I would bet a lot of money that efficiency does not persist, but I'm not going to argue with 15 targets per game. He's an excellent play at an elevated price. It's not hard to get to him because the slate is pretty soft. Outside of that, Justin Lockhart, every single route. Then it gets a little bit weird. Jackson Kanan at tight end went from 74% down to the 45% range. Trayshawn Hurry, he's been at like 55 to 65% of the routes. Matthew Coleman's been filling in exactly opposite of that. Been at like 35 to 45. And that's about it. Jacob Stewart is the rotational tight end with Kanan, and they're not using anyone else. So it's pretty clear. I think you want to play the top 2 receivers. Lockhart is a pretty good value on this slate. He still had 12 targets in their last game. It's basically everyone else who's been pretty dicey. I would play Hurry with his 59% total route rate this year. He's the stone min, so I'm not even that worried about it, but he could be usable. Otherwise, Washington State should be a lot of the chalk on this slate. John Mateer is very clearly the top play, I think. He has 314 rush yards, averaging over 100 per game. His role is awesome. He has 36 carries designed in the last 2 games. He's 11 scrambles as well in the year. Just such a high floor with him. His passing work has been really questionable, really questionable. But luckily for him, they're projected to win this game by a pretty healthy margin. When he is passing, it is a 53% completion percentage. He's 1 big-time throw, 3 turnover-worthy plays. So, man, lucky he can run. In the backfield, we've seen Wayshawn Parker take over, and I think this is here to stay. He's also not expensive. By takeover, you also just have to know that Mateer is getting so much designed work that Wayshawn Parker still hasn't carried the ball more than 11 times in a game. But it was nice to see him separate from Schlenbacher and Pulalisi. Both of them had 1 carry, whereas Parker had 10. Now in double digits, 2 straight games. His route rate has risen too, so he's fine. The receiving room, very clear. Chris Hudson, Kyle Williams. I would rather play Chris Hudson slightly, but route rates and target shares are both fantastic for these two players. There's nothing really to poke holes in. And honestly, their prices I think, are a little too cheap compared to some other players on this slate. Very easy to play them both. In the pass game, besides them, you should still have a lot of interest because they will throw the ball a fair amount when games are competitive. They've just been really sensitive to game script this year. So when they're up, expect them to run a lot. Josh Meredith, 97% of the routes last week. He should be the wide receiver 3. They run 4 wide a fair amount, so Tony Freeman is about at 45 to 50% of the routes, and then Chris Barnes, Trey Shackelford, they kind of clean up what's left. Andre Dollar didn't play in their last game, which is notable, but they're rotating so many tight ends, so I don't think you really want to get to any of them anyway. So pretty clear for me. Hudson 1, Williams 2. They're very, very close. Meredith is a 4, or the number 3, and then I would play Tony Freeman as the 4. But honestly, the price gap is not wide enough. I think you should really prioritize Hudson and Kyle Williams. That'll do it for this slate. Thank you guys for watching. If you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment or reach out to me on Twitter at Matt_Gajewski. We'll be back again on Friday for the main slate. Until then, good luck. We'll see you guys later.